Hello and welcome to the Breaking Ground show on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon. The show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on what's happening on the ground and to learn about new trends emerging within the construction industry and across Ireland's built environment. This show is brought to you in partnership with Place Engage, a data-driven platform for more successful public consultation and community engagement for your next development project. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sean O'Neill McPartlin, Director of Housing Policy with Progress Ireland. Sean, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Carol.
Sean, I don't think that I am understating it to say that Progress Ireland is one of the most speculated upon movements, one of the most anticipated, and it is probably one of the initiatives that I have really been waiting to see what happens. And this week we just started to get a glimpse. So for anybody who is not familiar, you might just explain what Progress Ireland is.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And perhaps you can share some of that speculation later on in the conversation. So Progress Ireland is a think tank, and a think tank is a kind of common form of organization in other places. In London, in certain areas, you can throw a stone and hit a think tank, and in DC, Washington, DC, that is the same. Whereas it's somewhat of an unusual entity in Dublin. There are some think tanks or quasi-think tanks like the SRI, which does fantastic work, and Task is another one, and they are independent. But there are very few independent think tanks who are not either in the industry, who also do great work, or on the government payroll. And as I said, the SRI are a great example like that. And we don't want to kind of replace any of those organizations, but we see ourselves as a think tank. And what think tanks do is they provide research. That's the principal thing they do. And they advocate for the policies on which they've done that research. So I suppose, and if you don't mind me carrying on a little bit here, Progress Ireland was founded with the tagline, ideas to unlock Ireland's potential. So of course, we're not, we have values. We're not just kind of blindly doing research. And we think Ireland has a great deal of potential, and it's getting held back by certain policies. So infrastructure and housing in particular are kind of holding back Ireland's growth. We've seen huge growth since the mid-20th century, and that was won on the basis of policy, a hard-won progress that my generation especially has really benefited from. I was born into an Ireland that was wealthy in the late 90s and was really on a steep growth curve. And now we're looking down the tracks and we're seeing potential stagnation. We're seeing the future of Ireland kind of getting stalled by the inability to build the capacity for the growth of the future that's going to increase living standards. So I'm thinking about, my children. I don't yet have children, but I'm thinking about my potential children. I'm thinking about the potential next generation of Ireland. I'm thinking, how are they going to be born into an Ireland with ambition, an Ireland that's looking into its future with optimism? And we think housing and infrastructure are kind of key to that. The third policy area we look at is science. And these all fit together in this kind of broad way, in that housing and infrastructure are the things that are holding us back, but a strong domestic economy that's highly innovative are the things that are going to push us forward. So we think by fixing or contributing to fixing housing and infrastructure, we can help Ireland kind of unclog some of the things that are blocking it now. And by contributing to a more kind of innovative environment, we can help kind of accelerate the next boost of growth for Ireland. So that's the kind of general approach we take.
In a nutshell. So first of all, thank you for that. In terms of understanding the structure, I think it is really important because you pointed to two examples that would receive government funding. So in terms of the think tank, I think when research obviously is one issue, but in terms of advocating policy, I think it's really important to know, if a think tank is on the government payroll, who's paying for it, what the vested interest might be or perceivably be. So what can you tell us really to help us understand the positionality of the body?
Yeah, so we're independent, as I say, and that's not just independent of the government, though we are independent of the government. We don't receive any government funding. We're also independent of any kind of political grouping. We're not affiliated with any party. None of us are party members of anything. We're independent of the industry. We don't receive any money from the industries that we're working on, so from housing developers or anything like that. And I think it's also worth saying we're independent of our donors. That is to say, our donors have no direct influence on our policy. So the way our relationship with our donors works is, as I just kind of outlined in my kind of opening answer, we have a kind of approach to Ireland's problems and Ireland's future. And it's not an unusual approach. So a lot of people kind of share our values and beliefs about what's wrong with Ireland and how it can be improved. And our donors, what we have in common with our donors is a kind of shared vision for Ireland's future. And they kind of look to us and say, we believe that this team and this organization, this niche kind of can be filled and can be useful in Ireland. And that's why they support us. It isn't because any particular donor has some kind of industry interest in changing some rule that's going to benefit them down the line. Is that they believe in Ireland. They believe a more prosperous Ireland is better for everyone in Ireland. And that's what we have in common with them. So it's independent of government, funders, and industry, I think.
Is it fair to say then that it is supported by philanthropy or through philanthropy?
Yes, so all of our support financially and otherwise comes from private individuals acting privately.
Okay. And I suppose that this is the really important one that I think isn't clear from some of the media reporting around the organisation. Which came first, the support of the philanthropists or the organisation?
So, of course, any organisation needs support to grow. And of course, the founders took a lot of risk starting an organisation, from what we were doing previously. So I think the organisation really, straightforwardly, that's your question, the organisation came first. We had these ideas, we had a team, all we needed was the support. But of course, we needed that support to really commit full time to doing it. So we spent a lot of our spare time for months building the organisation, building out our plan, and then pitching it to people. Just as I'm pitching to you today, we just talk to people. These are our ideas. This is what we believe. This is our theory of how we can get things done.
Thanks for explaining that, Sean, because actually I just think that they're really important questions for people to understand, say in terms of positionality. And I think you'd probably agree that maybe some of the reporting around the organisation has been a little unfair. It did make it sound like almost a personal hobby horse for certain individuals. And I think that comes from Ireland not doing philanthropy very well, not really understanding it, not embracing it as and not leveraging it like it might have been in other jurisdictions. And in fact, it's something that we know is changing. In the last 12 months, the Minister for Rural Affairs, Heather Humphreys, introduced a new policy around philanthropy for rural Ireland. And as somebody who has a business that is based primarily on the West Coast, I see that as a massive route to unlocking the potential and the lucrative goodwill that expats and those with a connection to certain parts of Ireland that have been a little forgotten about our own government. I see it really as something important. So in terms of philanthropy, again, just because it's just not well understood in Ireland, I think that people do think if a business or an individual contributes to a cause, they've a vested interest in that cause. So can you just maybe explain the role of philanthropy and maybe where that fits in terms of bias or non-bias?
Yeah, it's an interesting question in general terms. I have a little bit of background in philanthropy before all of this. And, there's a huge ecosystem, but as you said, especially culturally in the United States, of people giving money to causes. And, there's, in the United States especially, there's all this tax sort of thing. And, there's a lot of questions around that. And they encourage people to do it in the United States. But I think one thing that's really crucial for Ireland is our diaspora. And I think perhaps not most, but a lot of important philanthropic involvement in Ireland comes through our diaspora around the world. Organizations like the Ireland Funds, for instance, do incredible work, kind of rallying kind of Team Ireland around the world to give back. A lot of Irish people have done really well in the Americas in particular. And a lot of them want to give back to the old country and help it carry on. Maybe they've personally moved on from it, but they're kind of still looking back fondly to it and want to help out. I think the culture is slightly changing in Ireland as we've seen the influence of the people that left us and went to America, and we're starting to get a little bit influenced by them. And I think that's a good thing. Of course, Ireland is only newly wealthy in a certain way. So we're not really used to having spare money around. And I think America in particular is the United States is a kind of mature, advanced economy. And culturally, they're comfortable with that. And that comes with all the things that comes with it. But I think we're still very scarcity minded, and we're kind of new to being at the frontier. I think those philanthropic attitudes will kind of come down the line.
Yeah, I love that you've honed in on the diaspora being such a willing and completely underserved route for, and you've explained it very well at a macro level. So I'm going to take it down to a micro level and just share an experience we've seen this summer, and that was a Connemara business set up this year, exploring Galway Bay by boat, but telling stories, folklore, a lot of it through the Irish language, singing traditional music. The crew actually come out and perform on board. Shout out to the Galway Girl Cruises for anybody who's listening. But what really struck me was the groundswell of support for people who were no longer living in Ireland, but had family, particularly living around Connemara, wanted to support it. So any of those that were coming back to Ireland made sure to visit, to experience the trip and to talk about it online, and then to send other people when they went back to wherever they were in the world. And it was just so powerful. And the reason it really struck me is I happened to be on board around the week where International Day of Refugees was happening this summer, and the skipper came out from what the wheelhouse or wherever it is that the skipper drives boat from. And he, together with some of his crew, nearly all family members, performed the song Isle of Hope. And quite frankly, there were people who this was only their first, second or third trip to Ireland, but their families are from here. And they cried with the significance, with the connection of being on board, experiencing Galway Bay through the medium of a lot of Irish language, but also that strong connection. So it goes beyond goodwill, it goes beyond connection. And even when we say people who might have left these shores, you don't leave independently, you're leaving a family behind, and that family is very widespread. And so that's why when Minister Heather Humphreys introduced the philanthropy, the rural philanthropy policy, I'm really excited about the potential, because there, you talk about Ireland being newly wealthy. The reality is there are so many parts around rural Ireland, it doesn't feel like they're newly wealthy. In fact, they're still living with some of the legacies of ghost estates. The boom ever so slightly touched off them, but that's about it, really. But they got the full impact of the hangover after that. So the recovery was not balanced. It was not uneven. It was not even. And there are definitely parts of rural Ireland that the recovery just never happened, which is so unfair, because they're the parts that really got very little of the boom as well, but they got the full hangover. So I don't want to dwell too long on the philanthropy piece, but actually I think that this is something, while I know you've outlined your role there in terms of research and advocacy around policy and science, I hope that you will show a very visible way that people can adopt the model of philanthropy to really stimulate social change and help affect social change. And I know you're probably more focused on the urban, but so much could happen in the rural as well. So we're really hoping Progress Ireland will be a model. But look, let's take it back to the work that you personally came here to do. So you are the Director of Housing Policy. What's your own background, Sean? How did you come to this?
So I took a very strange route that might surprise people. When people, especially older people, I'm still just about young, and people tell a story about their career and it all kind of makes sense. It's like they were born with a mission, and it was a very linear path to the kind of achievement of that mission. I took a very weird path. I studied philosophy in university. I studied in Trinity in Dublin, and I never stopped hearing about that from peers. And then I went on to study in Oxford after that, and studied more philosophy. I couldn't get enough of it. And during my time there, I went to the UK during COVID, and my plan was to go become an academic in philosophy. And again, you can imagine how parents would feel about this, right? And my parents were very supportive, but there was kind of a raised eyebrow of, okay, interesting choice. And during that time, I got involved with some policy work. Obviously, COVID was focused everyone's mind on a kind of immediate problem, and there were a lot of policy problems going on at the same time. So I got involved with a group called One Day Sooner. I won't go into that too much because detailed policy things going on there, but the essential thing for One Day Sooner was that if a vaccine arrived 1 day sooner than it otherwise would have, a certain amount of lives could be saved. The number changed over time because the data changed, but thousands of lives could be saved with a single day of acceleration on vaccine approval. So we were working really hard on making the case to doctors and medical journals, with newspapers, to politicians, and so on, about the policies that could accelerate the development of vaccines. And that kind of began my focus on policy being a kind of lever for good. I worked a little bit with philanthropy with a group called Effective Altruism Ireland that I started when I was a teenager. And the basic idea of that sort of effective altruism approach is that there's more or less better ways rather, to help people through philanthropy. If the goal is to say save lives, it all depends on what your goal is. If the goal is to save lives, there's some charities that per euro donated saves more lives than others. And the idea was like, look, if you're really, really serious about saving lives, we can do better. And there's some charities that are really heavily data focused, and they're really going to get you good bang for your buck, was the idea. If you make an investment in a company, you're going to be really relentless about getting good bang for your buck when you're talking about profit. And the idea was to be just as serious about helping people. So that was the kind of background there. And then I kind of made this connection between policy could be not just philanthropy, but policy could be this really powerful. It's not a new idea, right? Of course, people think policy is a powerful lever for good, but it kind of clicked at that stage. And I got much more interested in it after graduate school or postgraduate work in Oxford. And I decided to move into housing at that point. And just for a little bit of personal background, I was sitting in my mother's house after studying so much and realizing I couldn't afford to go anywhere else through my perhaps inopportune decisions to study philosophy rather than something more economically advantageous. I realized that, well, housing is obviously really important. I'm sitting somewhere, despite my mother's generosity in letting me stay there, sitting somewhere I'd prefer not to be sitting as someone in my mid-20s at the time. So that's the kind of...
Sean, I'm going to say that to study philosophy, I don't think should ever be or ought to ever be considered inopportune. But I think it is very powerful what you say about policy being a lever for good, because that was probably the original intent of policy. But I think it's fair to say that original intent maybe wouldn't be as clear to people as it might be. Just the philosophy background is particularly interesting. Tell me, what is the one module or one lesson in philosophy that you would like every locally elected representative and policymaker to take? What one lecture or one module?
Very good question. I think there's a term in philosophy called epistemology. Epistemology is about the study of knowledge, comes from the Greek word episteme, and no doubt some ancient Greek scholar would be annoyed at my pronunciation. The basic idea of epistemology is like, how do you know things about the world? And I think a proper and diligent study of that sort of topic brings about a sort of modesty that it's like really hard to be right about complex problems. And we should sort of all be a little bit more modest about our approach and be ready to revise our position based off new information. Should all be a little bit less dogmatic about how the world works around us. It's a really complicated system. There are a lot of perverse incentives. I say, why I publish something in Progress Ireland's website, my name's on it now. People like, Carol, you want to talk to me about it, perhaps? There's always a chance with everything that you're wrong. And once you start talking about something, you get this incentive to keep talking about it. Like, God, it'd be really embarrassing if I was wrong about all this. I think like we should always be a little bit more modest. There's a good chance everyone's wrong about something that they really care about. And it matters most when it's a serious topic that you revise your position. And this is like, common sense at a certain level. But I think taking that really, really seriously might help. I'm not sure if studying philosophy would help, but
No, I do you know, I actually think this is wonderful. And like so many great, deep philosophical concepts, they've been broken down into really good 19-minute TED Talks. And so the one that particular concept brings me back to is the fixed and growth mindset. So essentially, if we could normalize the growth mindset instead of positionality within, say, political parties, so for elected representatives, then actually we would normalize with new data comes new insight, comes a shift in our thinking. And if it doesn't, then why are we collecting this data and why are we trying to get more information? And I think that that's probably very difficult to do within a political system, but from a policymaker's point of view, that shouldn't be difficult at all, because Ireland didn't have a lot of data and now it does. It has more and more and more. And in fact, arguably, we've more data than insight. We've much more data than insight at the moment. But that feels like a natural place to be, where you go from having no data to suddenly having a lot of data, drowning in data, not being able to see the wood for the trees, so there's an element of that before people get smart and then start to strategically use data to show you what they want to see as well. So interpretation becomes a challenge. But in terms of your role as Director of Housing Policy, given that you're operating now in an Ireland that does have more data, maybe not so hot on the insights, but it does have more data, what is your agenda for the year or 2 years or 3 years ahead within just your own role as Director of Housing Policy? Like, what are the big ideas that you want to drive forward?
Yeah, if you'll indulge me for a second, like we talked about the diaspora, and like one thing that diaspora brings is a whole lot of optimism. We sometimes laugh at American optimism. They're a little bit too excitable. But in America, for all of its faults, it's high status, to be an optimist and to be problem solving. In Ireland, pointing out problems is high status. It's not cool to be really hopeful about the future. So at a very high level, what we want to do is to show that you can be really optimistic and resilient about the future, or resiliently optimistic about the future. And just focus on, we're not here to complain. There's a lot of really good work analyzing the problems, telling us how bad things are. And a lot of it is very necessary work. We're not here to do that. We're here to offer really practical solutions that we think would work. Kind of crazy ideological solutions. We're not going to, a lot of people, of course, people always talk negatively online. Some people who kind of trying to preempt what we're going to do expect us to do something really, really radical, something really, what they really wouldn't like. I think they're going to be disappointed to see we're really focused on really pragmatic solutions that kind of take into account the constraints of doing things in politics. The politician that brings forward a solution has to get reelected. They're focused on their job, and we understand that we're not going to propose something that they're not going to do because it's going to hurt their ability to get their job back. That's just producing something without a real clear vision of how it's going to get done. So that's the kind of high level, and making it more particular. We're focused on, I suppose we're focused on the idea that it really matters where you deliver a lot of housing. So of course, there are big streams of delivery going on all over the place. And there are, of course, the compact growth goals set by the department of about 40% in the MPF. The new MPF seems to be about 40% again. But those are the trickiest areas to deliver housing, where there's lots of different owners. It's really hard to assemble large swathes of serviced available land without competing interests, making it difficult, or at least without a lot of people nearby who might make it difficult for you to develop. That's through third-party appeals or through judicial reviews and so on and so on. We all know those sort of problems. So we're focused on what you might call win-wins, policies that will benefit both the people in the area already and the people we want to move to the area, the renters and the new first-time home buyers and so on. So the first policy we just released yesterday, we're recording on a Wednesday. So on Tuesday, we released our what we call a Shomra policy. And the Shomra policy is just, it's not going to be new to any of your listeners. I suppose what we bring to it is we've talked to the people around the world who have implemented these policies, and we try to not just tell the people in Ireland, look, at work there or work here, but we try to adjust it to make sense of the policy here in Ireland, to contextualize what went on in other countries and to make recommendations based on that kind of contextualizing process. And, we all know there are things built in back gardens already. Many of them are legal, many of them are not. And these are, garages, gyms, and so on. We think people should be allowed to build homes when there's sufficient access and when the garden is large enough to preserve things like community space and so on. But even when you do all those things, where you make sure the access is bigger than the regulations even say, and our modeling does recommend that we measure access that is bigger than the minimum size in the regulations, and gardens that are bigger than the minimum size in the regulations. And we still estimate that this sort of policy would unlock about 350,000 kind of developable sites, making the Shomra a form of exempted development would, in other words, unlock that many sites. And of course, 350,000 people are not going to do this, and that would be crazy. That would be totally out of keeping with what's gone on in other countries. But it provides a way to deliver housing in the areas where it's most difficult, and of course, everywhere else too. And that's great. But what we want to do is give people options to it will help homeowners. They'll have income in their pocket that they might need, and God knows a lot of them do need it. But also will help a renter at the same time, and potentially one in their own family in many cases. So anyway, I don't want to talk too long, Carol. I'm sure you have questions.
I think this is really interesting, and the reason is, and I think this comes back to what you were saying about not starting out with something radical, because frankly, this is the opposite of radical. When people start to get into financial difficulties, one of the first things they did was see if they could raise the money to put a habitable garden room in their space. And in fact, it's something that there seemed to be almost were the local authorities ever so slightly turning a blind eye to it unless it was reported by neighbours. I mean, it certainly felt like that might be the case in the early years. However, there have been some really high profile standoffs between the residents in these and the local authorities that tells us, no, now we actually do need a policy. Now it isn't do what you need to do to survive these years and we'll turn a blind eye. Now it is very much, the language that's coming out from people who are in these standoffs with the local authorities, they all seem to say the same thing, and that is, we think the council is making an example of us. And there's a slight feeling that might be the case. So you talked about, taking an evidence-based approach to doing this and looking at where it works in other jurisdictions. So, like, for example, I'm familiar with it working in some North American jurisdictions where there are some restrictions in place. So, for example, you have to rent to a family member, that there's no this isn't a split your folio free for all, that actually this is to help somebody who needs to be helped, possibly within your family. But what of all the international data that you've looked at, the case studies that works, what combination do you think might be the best fit for Irish cities?
This really interesting phenomenon when you look at some of the international data, where a lot of times they started doing this sort of policy decades ago, way before they saw any serious growth in this particular typology. And what's common across all of them, particularly in the United States, but also Canada, is that they started off by saying, okay, just for family, but as part of the main dwelling. Okay, when the uptake was very, very low, kind of the graph looks very flat. And then they say, okay, well, maybe you don't need a car space, no minimum car space. Okay, the graph goes up a little bit, but not much, not very serious differences. And there's some kind of critical mass of regulation. And people in the United States who work on this call these poison pill regulations. The idea is that there's kind of a set of regulations that really kill people's ability to build these things. And those are usually owner occupancy requirements, which are roughly what the development plans currently have. We can, of course, build things in our garden. If I had a garden, I would be able to build something in it, so long as it's owner occupied. So someone who is part of the main household can potentially live in that. And that's in many development plans okay, given that they have planning permission for that particular use. So owner occupancy hurts it. Discretionary planning systems hurt it. Having to go get a special approval that is down to the discretion of a local planning authority often really hurts supply with these sort of small dwellings where homeowners are the developers in a kind of in a sense. And it's owner occupancy, minimum parking, things like that really hurt it. And so in Portland, in Seattle, and in California, and especially Los Angeles, once all these kind of regulations were sorted out, the graph kind of shoots up extraordinarily aggressively. Like there was demand there all along, but there are things blocking people from doing it. So in Portland, it resembles the development levy waiver recently. There was a fee to build a granny flat or Shelmer. They call them accessory dwelling units. So it's 15 grand or thereabouts. It was called a systems development fee. In 2010, they removed it. And within a couple of years, supply had shot up to 300%. The graph just kind of shoots up aggressively. So once you remove one of these barriers, people actually wanted to build these all along, but there are constraints. It was too uncertain, too messy, too financially burdensome, or the car park requirements, you just didn't have the space. So we think kind of learning from all that when thinking about the policy in Ireland and not building in these mistakes. Like if we want to do this, why not just do it right the first time and not iterate out for 20 years? Of course, there's always going to be ways to improve policies. And of course, there'll be things that we will miss. I think the crucial ones are that people are allowed to build these without asking for planning permission if the rules are clearly set about what they can build, what they can't build. As of course, the exempted development regulations are already quite clear. Keeping standards nice and high, and we have recommendations about how to kind of enforce those standards. So keeping standards high, but also allowing it to be exempted is a key part of it. I think keeping the sizes small to avoid annoying neighbors, to put it frankly. There's a lot of people who call themselves, YIMBYs in the world, and I don't need to explain to your audience what a YIMBY is or a NIMBY. Everyone likes to think of themselves as a YIMBY rather than an NIMBY, of course. But there's a lot of YIMBY people out there. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, of course, but in general, like around the world, not just in Ireland, who just kind of ignore neighbors, right? They just say, well, build whatever you want and just change the rules until neighbors will shut up. And eventually, like that, this isn't very sustainable. Like if people vote, and if you keep bringing rules that piss people off, the rules they'll be reversed eventually. And this happened in New Zealand recently. The rules, there was huge kind of upzoning, they called it, but it was really kind of didn't really think much about neighbors, and they're changing it now, thankfully. But they had to. They were kind of politically forced to. So it was kind of they made that mistake from the beginning. So that's the second thing, I think, taking the interests of neighbors very seriously and making sure these structures don't impose any nuisance on them. So we think these structures should be the same size as is currently allowed with your gyms and your studios and so forth that you're allowed to build in your garden. So the point, if you're next door, Carol, and you want to build one of these things, I'm not going to notice the difference between what you're currently allowed to build and what you're allowed to build under our recommended rules. I'm not going to notice the difference. Yes, there will be someone potentially going in and out of it, but there's already someone going in and out of it. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't look at who is going in and out of my neighbor's garden too often. I leave it to them. That's their private space. So,
Sean, I don't want to cut across you there, but can you just talk to us a little bit about the standards? Because I think that maybe might be one of the areas of pushback.
Yeah, of course. So I think when people think of, Shelmer or granny flats, they think of some kind of, but crudely, they think of something not very attractive. They say, God, I wouldn't want to live there. But if you look at what's being built in places like California, in places like Portland, in places like Vancouver, these are extraordinarily high quality homes. The construction industry has come a long way. These are kind of very attractive, small homes. with top kind of energy ratings. These are not kind of F-rated. I was asked on RT the other day, are these permanent structures? Now, I presume what the presenter had in mind was that these were kind of sheds just kind of thrown up, kind of similar to a tent rather than a property, a home. These would be built to the building standards are there. So these would be built to the same building standards, just with different sizes, the same fire regulations. These would be safe and energy efficient homes. And I think what's crucial is that, some people suggest removing standards in order to get prices down. And that's a kind of different conversation. You can kind of talk about specific rules there. But like with these sort of homes, you don't need to change the standards to get the prices way down because of their kind of scale. It is really simple to build. They're obviously quite small because you have to fit in gardens. So you can be uncompromising on the standards, still keep those costs down and free up more supply. So I think if people look at some of the images, and our piece has some images based off ones from California, you'll see that these are like very attractive small homes. And I think there are people, my age group that are living with their parents, living in crammer houses, 5, 6 more people in a single kind of family home. I've seen bunk beds in kitchens and bunk beds in living rooms. These are people with no kind of private space. What these kind of homes do is they offer high quality, warm, private space that you can kind of stake out your independence as a young person early on. And I think if people look at them, they'll be impressed. I certainly would now live in one. I can actually say I'd be happy to live in one. I certainly would be paying less rent.
Sean, is it fair to say that this is almost trying to retrospectively create a policy for a demand that was established and that the market actually tried to satisfy from the early days of COVID? So actually, as part of your putting together the research around this, did you look into the capacity of home builders and offsite and other modern methods of construction facilities around Ireland to deliver these, where we know they're meeting building standards, where they'll have a guaranteed 60-year lifespan, where you're getting the accessibility that is provided for in current building regulations. Did the research kind of tap into that? Because there's a growing market in Ireland, and bodies like MMC Ireland really just show the scale of and the expertise of manufacturers in Ireland. And we've seen that since really, going back to a certain extent about 2 decades, but really we saw this increase massively since the early days of COVID. So, have you kind of looked, has your research taken into even speculating on how many might be there not in compliance with planning?
Well, on the first bit of the question, I think we spoke to people who build dwellings and gardens up to the highest building standards. Of course, many of these, they're used for gyms and so on. They might have a room in them. Of course, what people do with them afterwards is kind of none of the builder's business. And I think everyone knows that some of them are used outside of, let's say, the regulatory allowances, to put it in a kind of euphemistic way. So we know that these things can be delivered kind of quite quickly with a very small team. When it comes to the kind of MMC aspect of it, my view has always been, look, you create this market for it, and we kind of have figures that that one of these builders has given us from a particular site that I visited, a very high quality place, and we got to around the 70,000 figure for one of these. And I've had some people contact me and say, well, couldn't we get it even lower? And my answer to them is, yes, of course we can get it lower. We wanted to kind of overestimate the figure to show that even if you have someone build one of these things brick by brick, it still comes out relatively affordable. Now, if there was the rule change and there was a market where firms could compete and innovate and get those costs down, that'd be even better. And that's a win for everyone if we kind of create that market and create that competition. So my view has always been, I've met a lot of people in the industry. I trust their abilities to bring down those costs, and once the regulations are very clear to them, I trust their ability to get the costs down within that. My view has always been, I'll leave it to them. That's
Yeah, that's a really refreshing sentiment, actually. So I know, and I suppose maybe I've been taking a very industry focused approach at this. So looking at the consumers, I mean, you talk about being in your parents' home. I have an adult daughter back living with me while she saves for a mortgage, and my first thought is 70,000 is a lot better than 370,000, but it's still 70,000. So actually, have you thought about the financing of these? Are these because look, to be honest, I presume a forward-thinking organization like yours isn't going to fall back on a really broken product like a mortgage. So have you thought about the financing?
Yeah, so I think a lot of personal loans would cover a big chunk of this. And I think looking at the US data, of course, wages are higher there, but so are the costs of the ADUs because they're much, much bigger in the US because the gardens are much, much bigger. Is that people are financing these through a mixture of personal loans and savings. And they're recouping a lot of their costs through renting them. So sometimes begins with the daughter getting a little bit of independence in the garden, but the daughter eventually moves out and you still have this dwelling that, as you say, lasts a long time, and you start to recoup the costs through renting. So you wouldn't have to use a mortgage product. You could use kind of small personal loans depending on your own financial situation. Of course, again, just like the industry, we can leave the financing to homeowners to do what's best for them, given their personal situation. I think like at the core of this policy is giving people options and choices. It's not going to suit everyone. Particular sizes might suit some people and not others. Particular use cases, bringing in a private renter versus bringing in a family member might suit them, or using one sort of lending product or another. Our kind of view is, so long as there are options for them, we want to kind of help give them the options, and we trust people to make the decision that's best for them.
Yeah, I love bringing that element of choice and trust in, because quite frankly, that's entirely missing out of our policy making at the moment. We are being overprotected to the point of being overregulated, leading to almost a stalemate. I'm conscious of time, Sean, but I do want to even get a glimpse of some of the other housing initiatives that are on your ambitions, your wish list, your is objectives too strong a word at this stage? But let's focus on big ideas. What other big ideas in the housing realm can we expect to see from Progress Ireland?
Yeah, I think we're really focused on the existing kind of urban, suburban footprint, the existing kind of built footprint, and how to kind of adaptively reuse some of that to deliver more housing in these really politically and complex situations where you have lots of owners. Shomer granny flats are kind of one way to do that. You kind of get what some people call gentle density. People start building these, densities per hectare goes up very slowly, very gently. It's kind of soft touch way to increase densities and get more people kind of close together near transport corridors and so on. I think other ways we're looking at it is making it easier for people to build on their own plots, on their own properties, so long as the kind of people around them are in favor of it. So that's the kind of, we're looking at that a lot. We're also kind of looking around Europe. We're talking to a lot of people who work in similar organizations around Europe and seeing what they're doing. I know Poland is in a kind of similar economic situation that we were in not too long ago. In other words, at the beginning of a very strong crest of growth. I'm not saying we want to adopt anything that Poland are doing, but we're kind of looking at all these cases, talking to people at the Brussels level, talking to people at the individual nation level, finding out what they're doing, what's working, what's not working. So the one thing we're doing, the adaptive reuse, looking at people being able to build on their own properties, that's in the pipeline. But I think at a longer time horizon, we're really trying to connect Ireland to the people who are building on the ground across the world and find out what they're doing and be a pipeline and a bridge to the people in Ireland. Of course, many people in the industry, many of your listeners will be very familiar. Many of them will have firms around the world. And what I say to those people is, our doors and inboxes are open. We want to help kind of connect Ireland to the best policy ideas around the world. So to any of your listeners who want to tell us about what's going on in other countries you think might work, we're all ears.
Oh, Sean, you're going to be very sorry you said that, because quite frankly, through our Facebook groups, through our online channels, we're just surrounded by people who can tell us everything we're doing wrong. Not always so hot on the constructive on the constructive ideas, but definitely willing to tell us what's not working. And this might sound almost a little bit too esoteric when you're focusing on policies to drive change, but how important is it, the social environment that we find ourselves in the moment, where there's a lot of public anger? Like I remember a couple of years ago around housing, and particularly kind of the NIMBY issue, we were really concerned that public apathy was a problem within planning. And little did we know that was the sweet spot. Really public anger is a totally different thing, and trust has broken down a lot. So I feel Ireland is in a very different position than it was even 4 and 5 years ago. Is there any element of us having to try tackle that to be able to start having a reasonable conversation? Because, I grew up on a dairy farm, and my dad used to say, you can't reason somebody out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And I think in Ireland, we've got a lot of entrenched positions that people didn't reason themselves into, so we can't reason them out of it. So how much do we need to almost address the mental shift, the mindset shift that needs to happen to start rebuilding trust, so that people really believe we're in this together and that we can co-create or collaborate a way out of it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, and I think there's a big distance between and not much public understanding of how policy is made, and there's a big distance between the people who think about policy all day and write about it and the general public. Of course, they see politics, they see media interviews and so on, but the nitty-gritty of trying to solve and balance different interests, solve problems and balance interests that goes on in policy organizations, I think that's very distant to people. So I think part of what we want to do is kind of make not just political conversations that people, of course, will have, and we'll all have them in our private time, but also like direct policy conversations, and make that more normal, a normal feature of kind of political engagement. I think a lot of the trust is between this gap. A lot of policy making goes on in a black box, and the public isn't, I won't say not trusted, but policymakers don't really come out and say, this is why we're making this choice. We've made hard decisions and trade-offs along the way, and you can see why we made this decision rather than the other. There's sometimes a sense of incredulity of why something happened one way rather than another. But I also think like a big part of it is kind of optimism about the future. I think one thing that's missing, and kind of, at the kind of core of what we're doing, is that, success can be really taken for granted by everyone, not just the political class. It's just, you kind of get used to doing well. And I think Ireland got used to doing well despite the crash. We kind of forgot about that very quickly. And we got a little bit complacent, and we thought this wasn't really hard won for, and we don't have to continually fight for it all the time in order to sustain it. Progress, social, economic progress is very hard won, and it's really hard to keep it. And I think we can never really, and I was encouraged to hear the Taoiseach talk about this recently, but we can never really take our eye off that ball to keep going forward. I think a lot of anger comes from is that there's like a sense of stagnation. It's like people are doing worse than their parents. A lot of people's parents were married by my age and starting to get a home. And there's this kind of delayed maturation, or this advanced kind of infantilization of young people that I think gets people quite angry. And I just close on the thought that there's this kind of zero-sum thing. When the country isn't growing, people start to think that group will only benefit if I'm harmed, or I'll only be benefit if they're harmed. There's always zero-sum. There can't be a win-win. But I think it's a better cultural attitude, and one that we have available to us if we wanted, is to think about win-wins, that we can all actually do better together. That's one thing Ireland has done, I should say. It's like, as we've grown, kind of everyone's grown with it. There hasn't been this huge inequality like there has been in some other countries. But I think that because we're not growing at the rate that we kind of mentally see ourselves as we should, and we're not as rich in real life, as you say, as we are on paper, especially outside of the cities, a lot of frustration comes from that, a lot of anger, perfectly understandable anger, when your child, who is now an adult, is with you every day. And that's great that they're with you every day, but you might be frustrated to not see them stake out their own course. And of course, people get angry about that.
Yeah, no, look, I think that that's a really reasonable thought. And I suppose I'm going to end this interview almost at the beginning of where we were. And that's where you very rightly pointed out that, you know, sometimes in Ireland, it's not cool to be optimistic about the future. So I'm kind of excited that you're going to make it cool to be excited about Ireland's future. So yeah, I'll stand behind that. Sean, just finally, you mentioned that your inbox is open, you know, your doors are open. How can people contact you? Because genuinely, I do believe that we have great energy, innovation, ingenuity in Ireland. I see it particularly across PropTech Ireland and the innovators who are really trying to drive change, the people who were driving climate tech solutions before ESG became a business imperative. You know, people who were genuinely well-intended. And, you know, I look at rural Ireland and I just see the potential so untapped. And if we're not careful about tapping into that potential, we're just going to create a museum that people visit from the cities at weekends or on summer holidays. You know, so there's so much of Ireland that is pure untapped potential, and the solutions, I absolutely believe, are out there in the minds and hearts of people. How can people get in contact with you?
My social media is open. My DMs on Twitter are open, so people can annoy me through that. Please don't abuse it. My LinkedIn, of course, and through our website, you can, there's a contact form and that will get to us, and we get back to every single one of those.
Okay, Sean, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our chat today. I am absolutely in the bucket of people who was very excited to see Progress Ireland come along. I am also in the bucket of the people that you called out for expecting radical change and might be slightly disappointed if the radical change doesn't happen straight away, but I'm willing to be patient because I know it needs to happen. But genuinely, best of luck to you and your team. I think it's such an important time in Ireland's history, and I think that this is a really interesting approach, and I absolutely hope it works. But like all things, I know it requires the buy-in of the community as well. So really, we hope that you will find a way to bring the community along with you. And I look forward to checking in to see how your own role as Director of Housing Policy is unfolding as new policies get pushed forward. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your time today. That was Sean O'Neill McPartlin, Director of Housing Policy with Progress Ireland. My thanks, as always, to show producer Katie Tallon and to the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. And thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of Breaking Ground. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all of the other Irish and international real estate and construction shows here on iPropertyRadio.com. Free.